Hey guys, welcome to this online presentation. We're going to get started in just a minute. I'm just going to give it another maybe 30 seconds or so, just in case anyone is just clicking through now. Got a good few people here on live, which is cool to see. For those of you that are now on, maybe if you just see on the right-hand side, you should see a chat area where you can type in a message. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves throughout this presentation, or put in any questions, and then I'll get to them at the end in a Q&A. So it might be worthwhile if someone can just pop in that they can hear me nice and clearly, that the mic volume and clarity is okay, and you can hear me okay. And if that's the case, then we will jump in and get started. So lovely. So there's plenty of cool people there. So like I said, we'll give it another 15 seconds or so. Just seems to be a couple more joining in. So what we're going to go through is, as you can see by the title of this presentation, we're looking at protein, obviously, but we're going to go through some of the background research on intake levels, distribution, so how that might be put across the day and what actual practical implications that has. We'll look at some differences in sources, and then that kind of ties into supplementary types of protein, which is kind of one of the biggest questions that there tends to be, of why is there different areas, or why is there different types of protein that could potentially go for, and that kind of ties back into the nutrient timing piece as well. And as you can see, why it's so damn awesome. So really, a lot of the time, a default that I go to for most people tends to be a high protein diet. Now, obviously, if we compare that to general population recommendations by nutritional guidelines from government organizations and so on, then a high protein diet isn't necessarily super high, but it's still something I think the vast majority of people increasing their protein to some of the levels we'll talk about generally has some benefits, and we'll discuss them briefly. So maybe as a way to get started, I think getting into why protein is just so awesome. I think there's no real need for me to go super in depth on these, because I'm sure most of you would have came across some of this stuff before. There's lots of research we go in depth to show each of these, but as a starting point, just why I think in general getting protein right, and the overall it being one of the main considerations of our diet, is down to a number of reasons. The first of which is being generally to do with satiety. So whether we're talking about a general person in the average population who is trying to decrease their overall caloric intake because their aim is to lose some body fat, or we're talking about someone who's already very lean, who's maybe dieting, maybe we're talking about an athlete that is trying to keep low body fat levels and maybe has to keep caloric intake down. One of the big advantages of high protein intakes is going to be that increase in satiety. And this also goes from both perspectives of, if we take that scenario I just mentioned of someone who is maybe very lean, who tracks their calories and macronutrients, the big advantage of including plenty of protein within that is going to be just to make that diet a bit more bearable. The fact that they're in a deficit is going to be tough, but if we can increase protein and ramp up satiety, and the same thing goes for fiber, then it'll make some of that at least a bit more bearable. But on the other end of the scales, if we're working with someone who generally wants to just get better eating habits to try and lose some body weight, it's unlikely they're going to have to be tracking macronutrients militantly all the time. And one of the big things that you'll often see with a lot of people just in the general population is so many people with poor quality amounts of protein in the diet. So it's miserably low in so many people who have maybe never looked into nutrition before, who have generally what we'd class as a quote unquote bad diet. Generally tends to be pretty low in protein. So if the change is just to increase the protein levels, that change alone can induce more satiety, can overall then feed in to leave that person consuming fewer calories without even realizing it. And this is why when people go on like a clean eating diet, or maybe they go on like a paleo diet or a low carb diet, something like that, they generally see some results pretty quickly. And one of the big things going on is that they're decreasing their caloric intake without it feeling like they're eating less food, because they're just ramping up their protein in general. When we look at the athlete side, there's obviously a number of things we could go deep in here, but on a very kind of summary level, we're looking at one of the big things is the decrease in exercise-induced muscle breakdown. So obviously, if an athlete is going into sessions with a suboptimal availability of amino acids, that's going to impact how much muscle gets broken down both in the session and in that recovery window. So if we could optimize protein, and then also that feeds into nutrient timing, which we'll mention in a bit, we can potentially mitigate a lot of that muscle breakdown that's likely to be going on when someone is exercising hard. Related to that, with muscle repair and then the rebuilding of muscle tissue, protein is our most important macronutrient. So regardless of anything else in that period after training, any athlete needs to be getting in a decent amount of high quality protein, because that is the macronutrient that's going to be responsible for muscle repair and muscle protein synthesis, as we'll see. And then also, if we're talking about someone in a hypocaloric condition, so this tends to be athletes who are in weight class based sports. So maybe it's a MMA fighter, a boxer, a powerlifter, someone who has to make weight for an event and maybe is dieting whilst having to do hard training. We want to obviously spare as much lean body mass as possible, and protein, or at least stopping it from being a low intake, moving up to higher intakes, is going to have a beneficial impact. And actually, only recently, Stu Phillips's lab produced another paper where they took people on a tough resistance training protocol and put them in a massive calorie deficit. So I think reduced their calories by 40%. And from that, they had a group of, I think it was 2.5 grams per kilo of protein per kilo of body weight, and compared to 1.5 grams per kilo, I think. If someone has the exact numbers, can let me know if that's right or not. I think that's what they compared, and showed a actual increase in lean body mass in the group on the high protein diet, despite having that large calorie deficit. So obviously lots of practical applications there for athletes. One thing that you will have heard about if you have followed the podcast is the influence of sarcopenia and muscle wasting in the elderly. And this is kind of like a double whammy that tends to go on, because as we age, there tends to be a decrease in our response to anabolic stimuli. For example, one of our main ones being protein. So a feeding of protein should be a anabolic trigger, for example, maximizing muscle protein synthesis. Our response to that tends to deteriorate, and we get this anabolic resistance with age, and this can tie into sarcopenia. So in fact, to get the same anabolic response from a high protein meal, elderly folks actually need a higher amount of protein to do that. But the ironic thing is that generally those older folks tend to have lower calorie and lower protein intakes than people that are younger. So it's kind of this double-edged sword of people that are not able to eat as much, but yet need to get more in. And there's obviously a whole other aspect to that anabolic resistance, but just showing that it's important, especially in elderly, when you see the link between decreased muscle mass and decreased muscle function with a whole host of other illnesses and mortality stats, that preserving as much lean tissue in old age is one of the best things that they can do, because the mortality rates that you look at is so highly correlated with lean body mass. And then the final thing, my good buddy James here modeling his bicep pose, showing that something that we've known for a long time, even without looking at any research, that for generally building muscle and repairing that muscle after resistance training, if someone wants to get jacked, then obviously protein, again, is going to be our key macronutrient to focus in on, the same way it is for any muscle repair post-training. So getting down into some of the more kind of research-based stuff, what we're looking at, just as a primer for those of you who are maybe unclear when I've mentioned things around muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown, really what we're looking at in any time we're looking at the accrual of either muscle tissue or preserving lean body mass, or even losing lean body mass, what it's going to come down to is the net balance of these two processes: muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. And in this diagram, you see this green line is going to be our muscle protein synthesis, and then this red line is muscle protein breakdown. And like I said, the net interaction, so when we look at these two together, the balance between them is going to be our muscle protein balance. And that's going to give us basically our best proxy measure for how much muscle we're likely to build or lose over a given period of time. Now, just a couple of things to point out that will be important because we'll come back to them later. As you see with this green line for muscle protein synthesis, this goes up and down throughout the day based on our anabolic stimulus. So, for example, when we get a feeding of protein, we get this increase in muscle protein synthesis and we get a slight decrease in muscle protein breakdown. So we're in a net positive balance for muscle protein. But then during that period between meals and when we start fasting, we have our muscle protein synthesis dip down to a low level and a slight elevation in muscle protein breakdown. And this is completely normal and this is always going to happen. And as we'll see, the question that often might come up when you look at this is, well, if we know that having more muscle protein synthesis is good and we don't want to break down protein or muscle protein, then why don't we just, in all these times we have these dips in muscle protein synthesis, just have a higher feeding of protein in there and just have more of these feedings? And we'll revisit that point later on, so keep that in mind because that is a very important question. But this is really what we're looking at in a lot of the studies because it's not practical to actually measure how much muscle someone has and therefore how much they've gained. So we have to use proxy measures like muscle protein synthesis or muscle protein balance. Again, as a primer, a lot of you will be familiar with this, going back to your old biology revision. When we're talking about amino acids, so this is even outside of supplementation, just those building blocks that make up each of the proteins, we have 20 of these. We have 9 essentials, you'll see on the left-hand side, and we have 11 non-essential amino acids. Just one thing to bear in mind, just in case you're not familiar with this, when we talk about a amino acid being non-essential, what we're really saying there is not that we don't need it, it's that we absolutely do need all these amino acids the exact same as we need the essentials, except for non-essential amino acids, we can make them in the body ourselves. By using these essential amino acids, we can convert them into our non-essential ones. So the reason these are essential amino acids is because we need to get them from the diet. Now, from there, we have 3 in particular that are going to be of relevance to us when we're talking about muscle protein synthesis and adding lean body mass. They are isoleucine, leucine, and valine. And as you may know, these are our 3 branch chain amino acids. So that's just down to their structure. And the reason they're important is because they tend to be the 3 that are most associated with the anabolic processes that comes from consuming protein. And in particular, leucine has been shown as the main trigger for muscle protein synthesis out of all these amino acids, and that it's the levels of leucine that we're getting from a feeding of protein that's going to be important, as we'll look at later. So it seems that we need to reach a certain amount of not only protein, but to get past a certain threshold of leucine to get the most anabolic response from a protein feeding. So that's why you would have in recent times seen a lot around not only branch chain amino acid supplementation, but a lot of companies putting a big focus on leucine supplementation as well. So just one other area to mention when we talk about do we need to spike your insulin to get the maximal response of muscle protein synthesis, because it's true when you do look at it, we do need this elevation in insulin for muscle protein synthesis to occur. So just a couple of research studies I'm going to point out to you. This was one from back in 2014. And what you have in this graph is in the blue segments here are just how much leucine there was at its peak levels. So at the highest point for each of these servings. So I should point out first that we have 0 grams of protein, 10 grams of protein, 20 grams of protein, and 40 grams of protein. There are 4 different groups in this study. And we measured what was the highest value their leucine peaked at. And then over the 4 hours after their workout, what did their insulin levels do? So that's the red bar here. That's what we call the area under the curve. It's basically a good idea of how much insulin there was in that kind of 4-hour window after their workout. And as we can see, as protein increases over time, we tend to get an increase in leucine levels and this big increase in insulin levels. Now, so in theory, then we're thinking, okay, well then, if this happens, that going from 0 all the way up, as we increase how much protein we consume, we get a higher and higher amount of insulin, and therefore insulin is supposedly anabolic, then it should go to reason that we just need to get more and more protein. But in that study, when you look at the results here on the left-hand side, you'll see that they had muscle protein synthesis compared to those different groups I just mentioned, so 0, 10, 20, and 40 grams of whey protein. Again, we have here the white bars are in the rested state, black bars are in the exercised condition. And what we're looking at here is their muscle protein synthesis response to these different amounts of protein. And what you'll notice here is on the top of each of these bars, we have these different symbols. So what those just simply mean in these studies is that if we have two symbols that are different, so for example, we have a star and a hash here, that means there was a significant difference between those two groups. So as you'll see, there's a difference between getting 10 grams of protein and getting 20 grams of protein, but there was no significant difference recorded between 20 grams of protein and 40 grams of protein on muscle protein synthesis. So a couple of things to be aware of here. This is one of the studies that kind of got people thinking, oh, well, that means that it doesn't matter if I only have, if I get any more than 20 grams of protein or not, that's the most that's going to give me this maximum amount of muscle protein synthesis because there's no real difference. And I think that's a short-sighted way to look at how much protein you could be consuming for reasons we'll touch on later. But what it did go to show is that just because you consume more and more protein and get a bigger and bigger insulin response, you don't necessarily get a higher muscle protein synthesis response. So what exactly is going on? Well, this is another study from the Journal of Applied Physiology where they essentially looked at that. So if you see on the left-hand side here, on the y-axis, we have protein synthesis, and on the x-axis along the bottom, we have insulin levels. And in this gray bar, you can actually see where the idea that spiking your insulin is good for muscle protein synthesis. Because when it starts out at this bottom point here with our insulin low and a low level of muscle protein synthesis, as you increase someone's insulin levels, so in other words, as we go towards the right-hand side, in this gray bar, you can see that as you increase those insulin levels, you get an increase in muscle protein synthesis. What you do need to be aware of, though, is at around this 200 mark here for insulin, it seems just a flat line in terms of muscle protein synthesis. So increasing insulin up to 400 or 600 or 800 or spiking it higher and higher and higher isn't doing anything extra to muscle protein synthesis. So all we have to be aware of there is that, yes, we do need an elevation in insulin for the maximum amount of muscle protein synthesis, but it's not a linear relationship. The more you spike your insulin does not mean you get higher and higher muscle protein synthesis response. All insulin is permissive. So that, in other words, you need a slight elevation past a certain threshold. And once you get that, then you can max out muscle protein synthesis, and any further elevation in insulin is not required. So why is this important? Well, then we have to ask, well, is insulin anabolic? Because that's one of the things we hear all the time. And we know, for example, bodybuilders will use insulin, or people are told, spike up your insulin to make sure you're in an anabolic environment. And really the way to think of it is just like I said, insulin alone is not what stimulates and drives MPS itself. What insulin is permissive, so it needs to go past a certain threshold. Where insulin probably is a better way to think of it being anabolic, as was outlined in this paper by Chow, is that the main way it's going to achieve an anabolic environment is by inhibiting muscle protein breakdown. So when insulin is elevated, you get an inhibition of that breakdown. So again, it's not just MPS we have to think about, it's about that overall muscle protein balance. And that's where kind of insulin can come in. So if we're talking about then what kind of fragments of our protein are going to be most anabolic, we said it's going to be particularly those branched chain amino acids, and it's going to come down to leucine particularly. We want to get past a certain threshold of leucine to trigger off that biggest response. And here we have some typical forms of supplemental protein that you could take, and we can see the reason why whey protein does so well in a lot of research studies and why it tends to be the kind of kingpin of most supplements is because it has both the highest percentage of branched chain amino acids, but also of leucine. So for a set serving of whey protein, you're getting a higher leucine content than some of these other forms. So 30 grams of whey protein versus 30 grams of soy protein is not equal for the effect it's going to have on the anabolic response because your leucine levels are different. So if this amount of soy protein doesn't have the required levels of leucine to trigger off maximal muscle protein synthesis, that's not going to happen. So the same amount of each of these is not going to have an equal anabolic response based on that level. It needs to have enough leucine to trigger that. And most of the research tends to show that somewhere around 2.7, maybe up towards 3 grams of leucine. So with that in mind, when we're talking about this maximal anabolic response, like I mentioned earlier, it comes down to a couple of things. And that question of, okay, we have these peaks in muscle protein synthesis as we eat different meals with protein in them throughout the day. There's obviously other things that can drive MPS. So, for example, resistance training does a good job of driving MPS alone. But when we're talking about these protein feedings, getting that maximal response of muscle protein synthesis, and then in between these meals, we get this drop off, and then we get this slight elevation in muscle protein breakdown. What we're really looking for is to determine whether we're going to have a net loss or net gain of actual protein balance. It's what is the difference in, say, these shaded regions where we're in a net positive versus these shaded regions in a net negative over the course of a prolonged period. So it's not one time point that matters. It's over a long period, so 24 hours, 48 hours, a week, a month, over prolonged periods of time. What is there a net balance of? Is there more synthesis or more breakdown going on? And that's what will dictate the changes in actual muscle tissue, not what you do on a one-off occasion. Then going back to that question I said earlier, that is a good one that a lot of people will outline, is, okay, for these periods in between our feedings, because we're getting breakdown here and not enough synthesis, what if we just add in more protein? So just keep feeding protein throughout the day to keep muscle protein synthesis peaked. And I suppose one of the best ways to show this was actually a study done back in 2007. This was Lane Norton and his supervisor, Donald Lehman. And you'll see here on the bottom, we have the time in minutes. We're going to track the levels of a few different things that they took in this study. First, they looked at leucine levels. And so over the time course of keeping leucine levels elevated, they were infusing leucine over this time course to keep it high for a number of hours. So as you can see, pretty quickly it got up to its peak point after about maybe between 30 and 60 minutes. They kept that elevated over past like 3 hours, and it stayed high even further. Okay, so we've got then like 4.5 hours, leucine levels are staying elevated. The next thing they looked at was insulin. And as we would have guessed, when you increase leucine levels, you increase insulin levels, because leucine is an insulinogenic amino acid. And that's one of the way it triggers off muscle protein synthesis. But one of the interesting things was, yes, we did get this increase in insulin, but by about the 3-hour mark, we have it back down to almost baseline levels, despite leucine staying elevated. And then the same thing happens when we look at muscle protein synthesis. We have MPS obviously elevates as leucine and insulin go up. But then again, by that 3-hour mark, despite keeping leucine elevated and keeping infusing leucine, muscle protein synthesis has dropped back down. So that natural rhythm that I'd shown you in that previous graph was happening regardless of whether leucine was kept being infused and fed to the muscle or not. That muscle protein synthesis was going to drop off. So as we can see here, that despite keeping leucine up, this muscle protein synthesis is always going to drop back down. So even if you try and keep feeding protein throughout the day, or in between your meals, you try and supplement with leucine, you're not getting any additional muscle protein synthesis. You just cannot keep it up. It almost has to have this lag time where it dips off before it can peak again. And we've seen this in pretty much other studies as well. This was an amino acid infusion study, and you can see they were measuring protein synthesis as well. Again, from the time point they started infusing it, you get an increase in protein synthesis at about 30 minutes to 60 minutes, 60 minutes to 2 hours. It's elevated. But again, by that time, 2 hours to 3 hours, you see a massive drop off in muscle protein synthesis, despite them continuing to infuse amino acids. So when it comes to the effects of different types of protein, I suppose our two main supplemental forms generally tend to be whey and casein. And kind of the question is it better to use one or the other? Does it matter which type you use? Should you use casein, say, at nighttime instead of whey, because they have differences in how much, so their time of digestion. So that's going to affect, number one, their muscle protein synthesis response, but also their breakdown response. So is there a better one? And I suppose the easiest way to show that if we kept all things equal, they're both really good forms of protein, and you keep every variable the same, what you generally tend to find is for muscle protein synthesis that you do get a better initial response from whey protein than casein, just because of that amino acid makeup and how quickly it's going to be digested, that you can get that response of elevating insulin, you get the leucine content, and you get a better MPS response in the short term. But when you look at this 2 hour period, there was, we get this, that means in the whey group there is more muscle protein breakdown at that 2 hour point after the feeding, whereas casein had a lot less muscle protein breakdown because they were continuing to digest that protein, so there was a longer time of amino acids being infused into the blood. Yes, you get a different MPS response, but remember, we have to look at muscle protein balance overall. So it's muscle protein synthesis versus muscle protein balance. And when you look at this, for example, yeah, you don't get the same response with casein, but you also get a bit less breakdown. So one thing I just thought I'd mention, because again, amino acids are such a huge supplement that are being kind of pushed at the moment. And I suppose in general, just for years now, they've been a big thing. And the kind of idea is, if I just add some more amino acids, then surely I'm creating an even more anabolic environment. And there's a whole loads of things I could look at why supplementing, especially just with, say, a branched chain amino acid supplement, is probably a bad idea. And I really see very limited uses where I would actually recommend someone use a branched chain amino acid supplement. Maybe if we're talking about an endurance athlete that's going to run for 3 or 4 hours and can't really consume some foods or some other proteins because it gives them GI distress, maybe the amino acid supplement may be useful in that context. But for pretty much anyone else, I see very limited use of why you would ever need to. For number one, if you're doing it to try and get those branched chain amino acids or that leucine, well, just look at your standard whey protein supplement. If you get a 30 grams or so of whey protein, that will give you enough leucine to pass that threshold, and you'll get that maximal muscle protein synthesis response anyway, and for a much cheaper cost than you would going and buying some branched chain amino acid supplement. But one study that I did want to outline, just because I think this is just really kind of interesting, it's also a bit kind of weird. So again, this is one study. It's kind of strange, and there's something weird going on. But I just thought I'd mention it because it is kind of interesting. This was one by Kirksick, where they took people that were resistance trained men, so they weren't newbies to lifting. They had experience of lifting weights. You can see that they were around 84 kilos on average with 17% body fat. So not overweight, not unhealthy, and they were used to lifting weights. They took them on a protocol for 12 weeks where they were training for 4 times per week. Apologies. And they had 3 protein supplement groups that they were going to check. So these post-workout supplements were made for 3 groups, and each of the groups was given 48 grams of powder. Now, that 48 grams depended on which group they were put into. The first group was a placebo group. So the 48 grams of powder they got was just a glucose powder. So this was just all carbohydrate, 48 grams of glucose. They were the placebo group. The second group got, again, 48 grams of powder, but they had 40 grams of whey protein and 8 grams of casein. And then the final group, again, had 48 grams of protein, but this time it was that 40 grams of whey protein, 3 grams of branched chain amino acids, and then 5 grams of glutamine. So both branched chain amino acids and glutamine are kind of really popular supplements that people are willing to drop a lot of money on, thinking it's going to make things even more anabolic and it's going to give them even better results than just using our standard whey and casein. And in terms of their diet, the only difference in both their calorie numbers and their macronutrients was that intended difference between the protein and the carb groups in terms of their protein and carb levels. So, for example, the 2 groups that got the 48 grams of protein had Overall, everything was the same except they had 48 grams extra of protein compared to the carb group, and they had 48 grams less carbohydrate than that carb group, and vice versa. So all their calories were pretty much the same. And they were put in a slight calorie surplus for the study, and they were given the resistance training. Now, when you look at the results, things get really, really weird. So they measured two outcomes here for their body composition. They looked at their change in lean body mass, which will be shown in the green, and their change in fat mass shown in the red. When you look at the carbohydrate placebo group, you see that they had virtually no change in lean body mass, and they put on a small amount of fat mass. The Whey and casein group, as we'd expect, had a big jump up in lean body mass because they were in a surplus, they were doing some training for 12 weeks, and they were given this 48 grams of a protein blend in after training. And as you can see, they had a only slight increase in fat mass. And then this is what really was strange. When you look at the Whey and when you added the branched amino acids and glutamine, you actually, it wasn't statistically significant, but you have a slight drop off in lean body mass. So basically they didn't put on any lean body mass, and they increased their fat mass a bit more than this Whey and casein group. So they lost out on all this gain in lean body mass and had a slightly more gain of fat mass. So they basically had the same results as just taking 48 grams of carbohydrate powder, which is just really strange. And again, I will make the point that this is something that is a kind of outlier of a study, because I haven't seen anything that has either shown the mechanism as why this happened, or even if this did happen again. But it was just worth pointing out that people spend all this time adding in these types of supplements when not only are they probably unlikely to give any extra benefit, but they may actually be doing something that is even more detrimental. Now, the only place I've seen a potential reason was actually brought up by Adele Musa, who runs Suppversity. So I'm sure some of you read Adele's blog. And he looked at another study where they looked at a kind of case study of 6 men, and they gave them either Whey, a bolus dose of casein, a bolus dose of Whey, or this free-form amino acid, which was basically the same amino acids you found in the casein, but they gave it in their isolated forms of amino acids instead. And it seemed that in that study that this free-form amino acid supplement was able to induce a negative leucine balance. Now, again, I don't know what the mechanisms are going on. It's super strange to me. I haven't found a good enough reason as to why this happened and what was going on, but something about this isolated form of the amino acids was different than just taking in the same as casein, and did something weird with leucine balance. So they actually had a lower amount of protein synthesis going on. Now, some things in terms of distribution that we'll get into to kind of round things off. This is, if any of you have people that you coach, this is something I'm sure that you're probably aware goes on when you look at people's meals for the day in terms of their protein content. So generally, people's snacks tend to be poor in protein. Their breakfast generally tends to be low in protein. They get a bit more at lunch, and then generally the bulk of their protein intake tends to come at dinner time. So dinner doesn't tend to be a problem, but throughout the rest of the day, they really struggle to get enough protein, especially if we're looking to get a intake of protein that's going to give us that maximum amount of muscle protein synthesis. So like we said, likely somewhere between 20 and 40 grams of, say, something like whey protein, depending on how big someone is, would give that maximal amount. So if someone's not getting enough, then they're not really maximizing that anabolic response. And indeed, we looked at this in certain studies when they looked at a 24-hour response to muscle protein synthesis. This was a paper by Mamaro, where they compared 2 different types of distributions of protein. The first one here shows our typical example of what we just saw is typical of a population. So sorry, that last slide was showing results actually pulled from NHANES data in the US, which is a huge study of observational study looking at people's dietary habits. And so that's classically what goes on, and I'm sure you've seen it in people as well, that again, they skewed their distribution. So they gave both groups 90 grams of protein over the course of the day. This group here, they had, again, a low protein breakfast, slightly bit more at lunch, and then just nearly the vast majority of it at the third meal or that dinner meal. They gave the most at protein. The second group, they gave a even distribution of about 30 grams of protein at each. So again, their daily intake was the same, but just distributed differently. And they measured their 24-hour muscle protein synthesis response. And what they found was the group that had that even distribution of 30 grams at each meal had a higher MPS response over that 24-hour period. So again, yes, your daily intake of macronutrients matters and it's an important consideration, but especially when it comes to protein, it's not the same just to get all that protein in one meal versus having some sort of distribution. Now, the thing to keep in mind is we've seen in other studies, like I'll mention in a minute, that it's not necessarily to keep spreading out more and more throughout the day. It's getting a balance of having some sort of distribution, but also enough to maximize MPS. So it seems that getting these levels above, so up to like 30 as opposed to 10, was giving a bit more MPS in those early stages. Similarly, another study that looked at MPS response was a 2013 paper where, again, they took 3 different groups this time and distributed how they got their protein over the course of the day. So it was 80 grams of protein that the 3 groups got. So this first group, so on the left-hand side here, we have grams of protein, and along here we have different meals. So the first group just got 2 meals that day, 40 grams of protein in each meal. The second group got 4 meals, and each of those had 20 grams of protein. And then the final group, as you can imagine, had 8 meals split across the day with 10 grams. And what they found when they looked at the MPS response of these 3 diets was that this actual middle group, so the red lines here, the 4 meals of 20 grams gave the highest amount of MPS over a 12-hour time period. So what that is indicating is it's not only important to get more meals or more intake of protein, because it seems for whatever reason that despite getting 40 grams at these meals, they just weren't consuming protein frequently enough. But then when you look at the other extreme, and this group that was eating more frequently, getting protein, the blue group, they just weren't eating enough at each meal to maximize MPS. So it seems somewhere in between of, number one, eating enough protein at the meal to maximize MPS, but also having some sort of distribution across the day that you can take advantage of having those peaks throughout it is the most likely if you do want to maximize muscle protein synthesis. So to kind of summarize what we've seen in research to date in terms of what we know in terms of what is an overall intake we should be aiming for. The first thing to say is based on a review paper by Arentz and Lantz from 2015 is that the current guidelines that are in by most recommendations of government organizations and certain bodies are likely inadequate for a lot of people, particularly if you're doing some sort of athletic training. So if you're doing some sort of training, then going with like an RDA of 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is certainly not an optimal intake. It's probably something just enough to get by that you don't get sick, but it's not something that is actually going to be an optimal intake for you. The next thing was taken from Eric Helms's paper, where he did a review in 2014. And if we're talking specifically about people who are doing resistance training and in a calorie deficit, then he made his recommendations based on 2 to 3 grams of protein, up to 3.1 grams of protein for every kilogram of your fat-free mass. Now, using it in these units of grams of protein per kilograms of fat-free mass is a lot more accurate, I would say, because you're taking someone's mass of their muscle into account as opposed to just their body weight. But most of the other papers use it in grams per kilogram of body weight. So this is kind of out on its own as one that uses it in grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. And this is particularly important when we're talking about recommendations, because if we take some of the other figures, so for example, one of the papers by Jacob and Gabe Wilson looked at resistance trained athletes, and they gave their recommendation of 1.2 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So if we're looking at a figure of grams per kilogram of body weight, for the vast majority of people, that's fine. It gives us a good idea of where we should be at. Where it might be breakdown, and this is for you guys who are maybe coaching people, if you take someone who is, say, obese, and you start saying, oh, you need to eat 2 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein, and this person may be like 130 kilos and have very little muscle mass, there's no way you're going to be able to get them to eat like 260 grams of protein a day. And actually, it's probably unnecessary for them to do that. So these numbers start to break down when you get to certain populations like that. But if we're talking about athletes, then grams per kilogram of body weight is generally okay to use. Similarly, when we look at a review paper by Stu Phillips, we see that going above 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, as of yet, doesn't seem to be any evidence of a benefit for body comp or on performance. So in other words, all the benefits we get of going up to that point seems to be the maximal that we're going to get. Just adding more protein doesn't necessarily give an added benefit. We're not going to hold on to any more muscle or build any extra muscle or perform any better. And in fact, if you keep increasing your protein higher and higher and higher, and that means that you have to decrease either your fat intake or your carb intake, then that could potentially be a problem, because you're adding in extra protein that you didn't need in at the expense of, say, some carbohydrate, which could power your performance. And then finally, when we look at distribution, one of the papers by Churchward Venn looked at a kind of general recommendation for most people of, if they're trying to maximize MPS as much as possible, then maybe a good way just to think of it would be to have 4 to 5 equally spread feedings of 20 to 25 grams of animal-based protein. Because again, if we look at something like a vegan protein like soy, we saw that its leucine content is going to be a lot lower. So to get the same anabolic response, you need a lot more of that protein. And as they mentioned there, the elderly may need higher amounts of protein to get the same anabolic response because of their likelihood of developing some anabolic resistance to a stimulus like protein feeding. So that's generally where we're at in terms of intake. So really, we could boil that down to, for the vast majority of people, an easy thing to remember is just take 2 grams of protein for every kilogram of body weight, and you're probably good. Maybe increasing it up slightly higher if you're already lean and in a deficit, or maybe doing a prep, or you're an athlete trying to make weight, or going slightly below that if you're someone who doesn't have as tight requirements. The last thing I'll mention is something that's kind of interesting. So we did say there was no real benefit to going above 2.5 grams per kilogram of body weight in terms of adding more muscle mass or increasing performance. But one thing that seems to be interesting is when you compare overfeeding, so consuming way more calories than someone needs, and the differences in where they get those extra calories from. And those of you who are kind of keeping up to date with some of the research Joey Antonio from the ISSN is doing, he's recently put out some more papers looking at overfeeding people on huge amounts of protein and seeing some really cool stuff with what happens to their body composition. So I think one of his studies had people eating at what looked like a surplus of like 800 calories extra a day, and yet not really gaining any fat mass. Now, there was obviously a lot going on there, and it wasn't as like super tightly controlled. It wasn't a metabolic ward, anything like that. But it was something that's interesting, that when you do start to overfeed, if you do it predominantly on protein, it seems to be better for body composition. And one thing here that I will point out, one of George Bray's studies, because this was a metabolic ward study, so super tightly controlled, and it does show you a couple of things going on, because generally there's, I think, a couple of questions that come up and a couple of misconceptions around overfeeding on protein. One thing that people will ask is, I heard that if you overfeed on protein, and again, this kind of comes off the back of Joe Antonio's study, if you just overeat on protein, you can consume as many extra calories as you want and you can't get fat. Or if you overeat on protein, you don't get fat. It's only if you do it with carbs or if you do it with fat that it's fine to overeat on protein. And then the second question is, well, what actually happens if I do that? And is there any difference between how much protein I feed on versus carbs and fat? So I think this study kind of sums up well what's going on. So what they did was they took 25 people and put them in a metabolic ward. So for those of you who haven't come across that, basically in research, like this would be a kind of gold standard thing to do. You take people in, they're in a ward where you can measure everything. They're given all their meals, everything is monitored. They're not out in the free world living, making choices themselves. Everything is dictated of what they do, and they're kind of controlled very tightly. For 2 to 3 weeks, they were fed just at their maintenance level. So the level of calories they needed to maintain their body weight, they were fed for 2 to 3 weeks. Then for the next 8 weeks, they were overfed by 40%. So a 40% surplus, which is a big jump up. So for most of these people, it worked out almost close to 1,000 calories extra per day they were overfed by. But where those calories came from were different between three groups. So they had a low protein group, a moderate protein group, and a high protein group. So 5%, 15%, or 25% of their calories coming from protein. And just to give you an idea, so that low protein group were basically consuming between 40 and 50 grams of protein per day. And so they overfed them for 8 weeks and wanted to see what happened to their body composition. So what they were looking at is body weight, fat-free mass, and fat mass. And when you look first at body weight, one of the really interesting findings that kind of sparked off a lot of people to say, oh, this is kind of interesting or weird, especially people who say are proponents of low protein diets, or maybe want to push kind of like a vegan diet or whatever that's generally low in protein, is that you actually see, yeah, we overfed all these people in a 40% surplus for 8 weeks. And look, the low protein group gained about half the amount of body weight. So that's good. They didn't gain as much weight as these other groups. So maybe protein is the problem. But when you actually look at the body composition, you kind of see what's going on. So when they looked at the fat-free mass, so their muscle mass and lean tissue, that low protein group actually managed to lose some fat-free mass over those 8 weeks, despite being in a 40% calorie surplus. So that alone is huge. You eat a too low intake of protein, you can even overeat. And so therefore you're in this anabolic environment all the time because you have all these excess calories. You can still lose fat-free mass because your protein intake is so low. And so again, look at what most people in the population who become obese are doing. They're eating a really, really poor diet, not doing any activity, really low levels of protein, and high amounts of calories. And so that's why we get this really poor body composition. The moderate protein and the high protein group both gained fat-free mass from being in that surplus. And then the final question to kind of answer was what happened to fat mass? And as we see in here, pretty much all the groups gain the same amount of body fat. So this study kind of highlights two big things to us. Number one, if you massively overeat in a calorie surplus, even if it's mainly from protein, you will still get fat. So yes, overeating protein means you can still gain body weight if your calories are in a big enough surplus. The second thing is that if you get a high protein diet, then yes, you may gain a bit more weight than a low protein, but you're adding more lean mass. So this person's body composition ends up being better than this person because they've added actually a few kilos of fat-free mass during those 8 weeks that they were in that surplus. So high protein feeding is important. And that kind of is pretty much gives us a good idea then on distributions and what we do. And that's hopefully there's plenty of questions. So if you do have some questions on that stuff, and I've actually, just so you guys have seen, Martin's been doing a sterling job here, as well as Tim, loading up those studies. So if any of those studies I did reference there, if you guys want to go and look at those, Martin and Tim have done an awesome job linking those up. Much appreciated, guys. I will run through the chat in a minute to go through some of the Q&A. But before I do that, just while I have some of you on the line, I did want to mention to you that there's for those of you that are based in Europe, UK, Ireland, etc. Just while I have you here, you may have already heard that the Sigma Nutrition Weekend is happening in April. So this will be the 9th and 10th that's going on in Dublin. And basically this is going to be 2 days. We're going to go through a series of different lectures and presentations with some discussions. It's going to be set in UCD. And basically already there's some really cool people signed up to it. So you'll be able to network with some really cool fitness professionals and some health professionals, some nutritionists that will be there. And basically we're going to go through all these big topics like some of the stuff we looked at today. So basically the topic we looked at today and this protein distribution was taken from some of last year's event. And so that's the type of information we're getting into, but in all sorts of other areas. So the setting is going to be the beautiful University College Dublin. And just, you can see here on the left hand side, our building over here is where we're going to be located. So we'll be there for the 2 days. You'll also be given your meals for the 2 days supplied by Gourmet Fuel. So all these meals get cooked from scratch by a gourmet chef. And for those of you who do want to track, all the macros will be listed on every meal as well for you. It's going to be a really cool event. Last year went really well. Already the ticket sales have surpassed last year's event. Here are some of the topics we're going to be doing with a similar breakdown of coming from an evidence-based approach, trying to look at all that research, and then trying to look at, well, what does this actually mean for those of you that are trying to apply this stuff? And so we'll be looking at all this type of stuff: appetite and satiety regulation. We'll look at some food intolerance, digestive issues, nutrient interventions in the obese, nutrient partitioning, behavior change, fasting protocols, ketogenic diets, nutrient periodization, nonlinear dieting, the gut microbiome, nutrient deficiencies, as well as some stuff on sleep, and a few other pieces that are still to be determined and or released to you. They're pretty much ready to go. So hopefully you guys are interested in that. And what I'm going to do is, as a way of saying thank you to you guys who've listened to me go on for the last 50 minutes or so, and actually taking the time out to listen to this. Number one, as I mentioned first, this presentation is only available to you guys, so there's been no replay that's been recorded of this that will be automatically get sent out to people. So those that are on live are the ones that are getting access to it. And as a way of saying thank you, and also as a way, just if you are interested in this event, what I'm going to pop up is an offer for you guys that if you do want to get on the event, I'm going to load up the pre-sale offer and give you a discount until midnight tonight if you do want to get on there. So currently you will find that if you go to the Sigma Nutrition website, the price up there is $275, and what we're going to do is we're going to change that for you guys until midnight tonight. If you do want to get on it, again, it's completely at your discretion. I'll knock off €100 off that down to $175. You should see it popped up on the right hand side of your screen now. There should be an offer live in place that you can click through that link. It won't take you away from this page. It'll just open up in a new tab, and you can take advantage of that special price. For those of you that do get on by the end of tonight, you with the people who've already signed on will be put in as we'll have a private Facebook forum. Like I said, there'll be that free lunch on both days, and there'll be a private Q&A webinar off the back of it as well, which only attendees will get. So if that is of interest to you, the offer should be up on your screen over on the right hand side somewhere. And again, that'd be awesome if anyone does want to go there and hang out, and I'm sure we'll be able to chat at the event itself, and also maybe hang out in the evening afterwards. So that will be there. I will now start looking through some of your questions and hopefully comments, because there's some super smart people on this call. So looking forward to seeing that. So bear with me while I make my way through that stuff. And we'll start getting to it. Again, if there's any more questions, stay popping them in. I will stay on until you guys are happy. And any research on hemp powder? Yeah, in general, if someone wants to go for one of the vegan proteins, generally I say hemp and pea protein tend to be pretty good quality. I know a lot of people go for something like Sun Warrior, which is a kind of blend, I think, of like pea and rice and hemp all together. In terms of their leucine content, I wouldn't know offhand. I'm sure it's very easy to find out, especially for that blend. You'd have to look up. But in general, of all the kind of vegan proteins, I tend to think, yeah, pea and hemp are pretty decent choices if someone needs to either avoid dairy or go for a vegan one because they are vegan. Cynthia, if we can't make the weekend, is it possible to purchase the talks? Right now, I don't think there will be a recording of the full thing in its entirety, just because I want the most value to go to the people that are there. And I think maybe take away slightly if all of it is just given directly out immediately, but it's likely that some of the content will probably surface at some stage in some format, but I just don't know what yet. But probably not the entire thing. But some of the same concept will be hopefully given out to people that are there. A really good question here from Tim. Are you aware of the potential risks of using lower quality protein and then just adding leucine? Isoleucine and valine seem to be largely ignored in recovery and anabolism conversations. That's actually a really good point and something that I would probably have to look a bit deeper at, and it's not something that I've given enough attention to. I think that's actually a really, really good consideration. So the idea of, well, if it's just a leucine threshold that we care about, why don't we just get a protein with a poorer amino acid profile and just then dump in some leucine on top of it? Again, I don't know if there's been something that's directly compared that. It does definitely make sense that there could be some important differences because depending on the content of the branched chain amino acids. So if you've seen anything on that, Tim, I'd love to hear about that or see that, because I think it makes a lot of sense. But certainly, I think the big thing that I've tended to talk to people about is when they've just used branched chain amino acids versus, say, something like an essential amino acid powder or a complete protein, is that the easiest way to think of it is if someone doesn't have sufficient amounts of all those essential amino acids and then they just go and supplement with some leucine or just the branched chain amino acids, yes, you do get that stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, but you don't have all those amino acids to go and actually build with or to synthesize with. And I think actually Joseph Agu does in his presentations regularly does a good analogy of thinking of that triggering off as MPS of going and telling workers to go and work, but if you don't have those actual amino acids, you don't have any bricks to go and build with. But that's actually a good point, Tim. So if you've seen something, I'd love to hear it. Carol and also Nilo as well. Please host an event in Canada. That would be cool. I hope to get over to North America at some stage, if someone will have me. So again, that's up to someone else, but nothing planned at the moment. But be happy to at some stage. David, would 5 meals with 20 to 25 grams of protein per meal during intermittent fasting negatively affect MPS versus 5 meals over 12 hours? Yeah, the thing with intermittent fasting is this one is something that fascinates me because personally, when I'm in a calorie deficit or generally just on days where I don't have a whole lot going on in the morning, I just like intermittent fasting. I like a 16 and 8 fast. Like I won't eat my first meal until maybe early afternoon. It just suits my structure of my day better. I feel fine on it. I prefer having more meals in the afternoon. And when you look at a lot of the data on intermittent fasting, it's you don't really see the decreases in lean body mass that might be there if everything was as clear as, oh, if you have to hit all these uh, muscle protein synthesis, you have to hit that as hard as or its peak point often throughout the day. And if you miss something in the morning, then you're going to have more muscle protein breakdown. You don't really see that in practice with a lot of this stuff. And I think there's a bit more going on with fasting. It's something that really intrigues me. To be honest, I think the general way I'll break it down is there's probably not likely to be massive differences if you're just talking about retaining lean body mass and maybe trying to lean out a bit, or you just want to maintain weight, or you want to gradually even gain weight over time. If intermittent fasting suits you better and you adhere to that better and it's something that allows you to hit your overall goals for the day, then go with it. But the one place I would say maybe it's not optimal is if someone is actively trying to gain as much lean body mass as possible in a set period of time. and that's their main goal, then I would probably go with splitting those meals, those 4 to 5 meals over the course of a day, with like those 3 hours or so between them. So you're just to cover your bases of triggering off maximal MPS as much as possible. But apart from that, I would say go with kind of whatever suits best. Martin, when training veggie and vegan clients, how much attention would you pay to incomplete/complete protein when calculating daily totals? So yeah, this is something that we try and take care of based on their. What I've done is just created a list of them. So if it's a vegetarian client, they will have their list of animal-based proteins and then also plant-based proteins that they can fit in towards our targets, and then I'll give them an idea of, okay, this type of portion size would relatively come out at this much protein. And for them, it's about trying to make sure that we're getting an emphasis on getting at least a decent amount of those animal-based proteins. So if they're having some egg or having some dairy products, for example, for those that are vegan that are not going to have any of that, then it becomes a bit more of an issue. So at least initially, when taking an analysis of their diet, I'll definitely look to see where those proteins are coming from, and if they're overly reliant on one particular source, that might leave them deficient of a certain amino acid. So for example, if they're doing something crazy like getting virtually most of their protein intake from beans, then they're likely that they may have a methionine deficiency, or at least not getting enough methionine because they're getting something that doesn't have any. So in the initial viewpoint, I'll definitely analyze it, but over time, then it doesn't mean that every single time they put a food diary that I have to go through it. It's more just seeing what they're habitually doing, if that makes sense. Carol, there's a lot of information circulating that you can only absorb 30 grams of protein at a time. Is this true? In short, no. If you eat a bit more than 30 grams, it doesn't really, it's not going to just magically disappear into thin air. Where that's probably coming from is, again, people talking about the MPS response possibly, and again, it's just an old myth as well that you can't absorb, and that number changes X amount of protein at a time. I wouldn't worry. Now, if someone's doing something ridiculous, like, I don't know, like 300 grams at once, which is virtually nearly impossible, there's something weird going on there. But no, having more than 30 grams at a meal is completely fine. Sasha, definitely interested in intermittent fasting. Is it still best to spread the protein over the feeding window equally, or just focus on getting it in at any time? Yeah, so in that case, if you are going with a daily intermittent fast, so or even 8 hour eating window, in that case, yeah, I would definitely focus on spreading it across that, because you've already taken away that early part of the day or wherever you take your fast, where you've missed a chance to get some protein in. So um, I would definitely, for your 8 hour window, or whatever your window of eating is, definitely try and spread some protein across that time frame, just so that you do get as much as you can with your given time point. And I think, say, having in that 8 hours, having 3 servings of 40 or 50 grams of protein is going to be better than just having one massive meal of 150 grams. Tim has put in there, for anyone looking, Sun Warrior has basically 1.3, 1.4 grams of leucine per serving. So if you want to get to that MPS response, you want 2 servings, or 2 scoops of, or whatever. Omar, intermittent fasting, can you put on size using this method? Yeah, it's definitely possible. If you want a resource to go and look at, I really like Martin Birkin, which he's at leangains.com. And he's like, time and time again, people have been able to put on muscle mass whilst doing intermittent fasting. So definitely possible, 100%. My only comment earlier was talking about someone that's actually just trying to absolutely maximize every little bit that they possibly can. And if they're doing that, so like they're going to be competing on stage, then maybe they want to go with protein spread across the day. Andy, in terms of being optimal for body composition improvement, muscle gain, protein powers versus real food, really, it's not really a debate of one versus the other. As a general philosophy, I like the food first approach just because you're going to get so much more than trying to get by just on supplementation. There, you obviously take the nutrient density of your foods into account. You obviously then take things like actually having to eat a meal versus just drinking down a protein shake. But in general, if you're just talking about like one meal a day or two meals a day or just something post workout, whether you have your protein from whey protein or equivalent amount from a dairy product, won't have a dramatic difference. But in general, I always go with a kind of food first approach of most of your diet and your nutrition should be made up of real whole foods that you're cooking from scratch. But if you need to supplement to get your protein intake up, that's absolutely fine. So it's very rarely going to be one versus the other, that it's all or nothing. It's both have their place and just use a combination of the two. Oshin, would these protein recommendations be similar for general health as for performance and fat loss? What do you think of those claims that excess protein can cause kidney damage, scaremongering, or is there anything to it? For general health, pretty much the same for most people that come in contact with, depending on where their start point is. I think if they can get to like 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, it's really good because again, it does all those things we talked about. Helps with retaining lean muscle, gives them more satiety, so they're unlikely to overeat. Another good byproduct is if you ask someone to eat a high protein diet, it's very difficult for them to turn to poor quality choice foods. It almost imposes better food choices on them because you think of the things that are typically going to be high in protein. It's going to be some meat, it's going to be some fish, it's going to be some eggs, it's going to be some dairy produce, all good quality foods. It's not going to be too much junky stuff, that they're going to turn to. So yeah, I would go for 2 grams per kilo as an easy target. But again, for a lot of people just starting to make change to their diet, that's going to be really, really hard to do. So really the bigger thing to think about is just trying to get them to increase it above their current baseline and edge that up over time. In terms of the health issues around excess protein, kidney damage, yeah, that's complete scaremongering. The only issue is if someone already has a pre-existing condition, then they would have already been told by either a doctor or dietitian. Like if they have already pre-existing kidney disease or some sort of clinical issue that requires a low to moderate protein intake, then yeah, sure. But for anyone else, high protein intakes do not induce kidney damage, or high protein intakes do not cause it. It's only if someone already has it, it may exacerbate things. What would be best pre-workout? Amino acids or whey or neither? Uh, Really, it depends on the overall context of someone's diet. If someone is already got sufficient fuel in their previous meals, they may not need something immediately pre-workout. If they haven't eaten already and they just want to get a meal in and they're looking for a source of protein, then yeah, I think whey and casein, every single time in research, you will see whey and casein will outperform or at least never be beaten by amino acids. So you're just paying over the odds for an amino acid supplement that you don't need if you're taking it, whether that's pre-workout or during an hour's lifting session. You don't need to buy an amino acid supplement. Just use some whey and you can get the same amount of branched chain amino acids, the same amount of leucine content for basically half the price or less. Tim, what software tools do you use in your practice? My Fitness Pal, any tracking software or anything else on your end? My Fitness Pal, I get people to use to track themselves. One thing I have done to analyze diets is a piece of software called Nutritics. They're actually an Irish company, and their software is pretty decent. It will have a lot of the foods that most of my clients will obviously have, and so if they give me, so for people that don't want to use an app or tech or aren't into that and give me like written food diaries, I'll pop it into that, and it's good at flagging up an overall nutrition composition. It allows me to create then what a samples day might look like. It allows me to track their stats over time. So Nutritics is a pretty decent piece of software. I can't remember what the current price for it is now. But that is something that I have used. But for a lot of the time, you can get away without it. I think there's a relatively short learning curve for getting people to use MyFitnessPal, at least initially, to track. And if they decide long term that's for them, that's fine. But a lot of people that I work with will use it for a week or two to get a baseline, maybe to open their eyes of what they're actually consuming, and then from there it's kind of more based on just changing their structure of their diet more so. Oh yeah, for your question, Oisin, Martin has just linked up to Stu Phillips' interview with Martin McDonald, where he talked about protein and kidney damage. I think there's also loads of articles that Joey Antonio has done on this as well. That is kind of evidence based. That shows you. Any opinion on the mast supplement? The guys on Nourish Balance Thrive use it, but Tommy Wood has questioned the studies used to show whey protein was badly used by the body. But I'm just wondering about the effectiveness of mast itself. So, or no, you've corrected MAP, MAAP. Sorry, I haven't looked into that supplement. Owen, if you've got a link, you can pop it up and I'll take a look. But I haven't seen what you're referring to there. Sorry. Effects of adopting dairy intolerance screen genetic perceived prevalence of the inability to digest lactate is somewhat overestimated. It is a preserved genetic trait. Your thoughts? Okay, I think what you're getting at there is people that have an inability to tolerate lactose. I think that's what you're getting at, Richard. For the easiest way, again, we could go down a whole rabbit hole here, but the most obvious or the kind of the Cliff Notes version, I would say, is that for people in Northern Europe or Northern European heritage that have came from cattle herding heritage, so people that are native to like UK, Ireland, Scandinavia, a lot of people in North America that are Caucasian are probably have a decent level of lactase or of lactose tolerance because they have lactase persistence. So they have the ability to keep hold of that enzyme into adulthood. And so a lot of people will generally be fine with most forms of dairy. Now, dairy tolerance is probably on a spectrum as opposed to someone being either able to handle dairy or not be able to handle dairy. It's probably more a case of people that have perfectly fine with everything, all the way down to the other end, people don't have able to tolerate any dairy. There's probably a lot of people kind of in between that spectrum, where some people might not feel good on, say, cow's milk because they just can't deal with that amount of lactose, but they're fine with, say, butter or some cream or some high fat dairy produce. So but for most people, I think dairy is a really good quality food unless they have an obvious intolerance to it. So if they notice some symptoms that go away when they take it away, then it's completely likely that they could have an issue that they can work out. But in general, for people that don't notice any symptoms, yeah, I think dairy is a really good protein source. I hope that answered your question. That's what I was at least taken from it. Kevin goes and says, even though daily protein intake matters the most, if we consider nutrient timing, what would be the optimal times throughout the day for protein ingestion to maximize NPS? Yeah, so if we're talking about the acts, like to cover all our bases in theory, like to get the maximal amount of NPS for someone trying to, say, build muscle, and that's their primary goal, then so far the research has shown that probably I would say 4 times a day at least, and having that spread where you have maybe like 2 to 3 hours between those meals. So that means that you're getting enough time for the NPS will dip back down, and then you're spiking again with another bolus dose. So for most guys with a decent amount of muscle mass, you're looking at least 30 grams of protein, maybe up to 40 for really big dudes. So if you say 30 plus grams of protein, at least 4 times throughout the day, and then obviously you want to, on top of that, make sure you hit your daily protein target. So that means you may have extra in each of those meals. Now, that said, if someone is eating to try and gain body mass, they're probably going to be eating 4 times throughout the day anyway, maybe a lot more to try and get in those calories. But I mean, it's generally what most people are going to be doing. But I would just say throughout the day, you have 4 to 5 times at least where you're getting above 30 grams of protein. And from what we know now, that's probably likely to maximize muscle protein synthesis. So that response. Then obviously on top of that, take care of total daily protein intake, daily calories, etc., etc., etc. Perfect. Thanks for that link, Owen. I will check into that. I probably won't have time to look detailed into it now. And Tim, if you're still on, Martin is linked up to Nutritics, which is that piece of software. And I think that's pretty much it. If anyone has any final questions, I will try not to keep people going too long. That's pretty much it. If there is any questions that people didn't get a chance to ask yet, just feel free to hit me up on social media or send me an email and I'll try and get them answered. For everyone that's listening now, really do appreciate it. I mean, it's a lot of time to take out of your day to come and listen to me go on for about an hour and 50 minutes at this point. So I do appreciate it. For everyone that asked questions as well, thank you so much. I hope there was just at least even just one little piece of information that added to your base knowledge, or even just confirmed some things that you already know and shored things up. I hope this was useful to you, and I really do appreciate it. I hope you got something from it. And then for anyone that comes along in April, looking forward to meeting you in person and getting to hang out both at the event and maybe in the evening time afterwards as well. Should be really good. And if you do want to, those of you that are left, that offer should still be there, and you can click through that link and leave it open. That will be open until midnight tonight. And if for any reason it doesn't work, just send me an email and I will sort you out. So thanks very much, guys. I really appreciate all the kind comments that are coming through. It means a lot to know that you got some value from it, and thank you guys for actually turning up. So that's pretty much it. I'll let you get back to your evening, guys. Like I said, if there's anything on the back of it, hit me up on social media. And until then, have an awesome evening, guys.